Yo, let's go. What's up? Today we're covering Suetonius, the 12 Caesars. Y'all, this is gonna be fun. this is quite the this is quite the content we got here today. I mean, it's crazy because we're gonna be reading from a first century AD Roman historian who writes like a I mean, he writes like a novelist. I mean, he spins a good yarn. Okay, let's put it that way. But whose content is so wild that 2,000 years later, and I still am going to have to edit some of this as I speak because the algo is not going to like is not going to like the ancient Roman text here. I'm serious. This is crazy. So I just decided to do this because this is one of my favorite books. I love this book. The book is called The 12 Caesars by the Roman historian Suetonius, who, along with Tacitus and his Lives of the Caesars, the classical Roman historians, Livy, Polybius, all those guys, really give us what we know about. I mean, his history is a lot different from it's different from any other history. For one, because he sort of itemizes information. He doesn't it's not chronological per se, and it really he even though this is a literary stream, right? Even though this is a literary, purely literary stream, um that we're going to read this because number one, the content is how can I put this? His legacy is, as I said in the video description, his legacy remains intact. I mean, we see a lot of Shakespeare in this. We see some of the Renaissance writers. We see writers in the contemporary era who are still either mimicking the language in this book or just the content in terms of what we know about the Caesars, what we know about the Roman era. And so I thought it would be good to read this because number one, it's an influential book. Number two, although it's a history, it is Roman. Dog, stop that. Although it's a history, it's a oh, now she looks like an angel because I threw that on her. Or it's a history, but it's also the literary quality of this, and he's self-referential in this book. I mean, Suetonius was known also as a grammarian, etc. So it reads like literature. This is it's going to be a really fun book. You know, some people watching this may not know much about Roman history, and that's fine. That's fine because it'll be fun for you to come to this brand new. Um, if you are a scholar of Greco-Roman history, etc., or the classical era, then hopefully you'll find this. You'll find some fun things in this. But it's not just going to be fun. I mean, what we're going to read is quite dark at times, obviously, because we're talking about the imperial terror, right? The terror of the Imperator, and yeah, it's quite dark. But I do love this book. I love the way that he writes. When I was in grad school, my own my own book of poems is partly I'd say about halfway influenced just by this book and Tacitus. And the two writers overlap at times, and Tacitus has some more in-depth accounts of some of the Caesars, especially Nero and the deaths of others. But Suetonius really tells a good story and spins a good yarn. And he's well, I think we're going to have fun. My thesis per se in this one is that I would say while we're reading this, pay attention to the how the power structure works in ancient Rome, because as we'll read in a little bit of the introduction, um, the scholarly attitude towards Rome has been one of it's strange because it sort of started out with the the emperor, the emperor's law or the emperor's rule, whatever he says goes, right? He has absolute power. And then it sort of there was this sort of reactionary movement in academia where it became, no, it's overblown. He's more of a figurehead, and it's actually sort of the senatorial structure and the power of the Roman Empire as a whole, including the outlands that influence the entire methodology of the Roman Empire and its administration. But I would say that, it's somewhere in the middle. It's we okay. Let me simplify this. The Pax Romana became the Pax Britannica, which became the Pax Americana, and we still continue to live under this system. Um, Now it's a little bit different, obviously, because the power structure is certainly more oligarchical. But as we'll see when we're reading this, a lot, so much in this book, is still now. It's still extant now, and the way that the power structure works, the way that the power class has their various intrigues and their shenanigans, the way that they run the empire is still in place today in terms of at the top levels. And I think that we'll see that, yes, the emperor is obviously the Roman emperor. He's powerful. He has power of life and death. And some of the more heinous things that the Roman emperors do have not gone away. They're just hidden from us because of modernity and because of the world we live in now. But I would say that pretty much it remains the same in that respect. Um, we'll see that, it's crazy that some of these people would become emperor, and the thought would be that this guy has absolute power over this entire empire. There's no way. There's no way that, Claudius, for example, was this could be who he was without a vast power structure based in the power classes of the Roman Empire. Now, I'm simplifying that a lot, but that's essentially my thesis, that we're going to see that a lot of the shenanigans and the depravity are recognizable. And although they're shocking, what I think is really shocking is that this is 2,000 years old and not much has changed. So let's dive into it. Okay. First of all, Suetonius was born in AD 69. And the 12 Caesars that we're covering are, of course, Julius Caesar, Augustus, right? Octavian, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. And we're going to spend most of our time, obviously, on Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Nero, and Caligula. We're not going to spend that much time on Claudius, and the latter six we're not really going to spend that much time on. We're going to go with the most interesting ones and the ones that you've heard of the most. You've heard of them for a reason. So let's go ahead and dive in. First of all, we've covered Julius Caesar here, right? We've covered the Shakespearean play, Julius Caesar. Go see my Julius Caesar speech. There's a lot about Mark Antony. I mean, there are whole sections of Shakespeare's Caesar. Shakespeare is known that Shakespeare, we know, took a lot of his material. Excuse me, folks. Took a lot of his material from Ovid and from a variety of sources, mainly from Ovid. But we can see clearly that he lifted entire passages from this book because it's especially for Julius Caesar. And so what we're going to do is we're not going to do we're not doing a lesson. We're not doing it's not a history stream. We're going to talk about the text as we always do. But who doesn't want to know about the outrageous stunts of the Caesars? So that's going to be the meat of the stream. That's really what I'm going to get into the most here. But let's start by talking just about the text and where the text comes from and why it's important. This says, I'm just going to read briefly from this intro and then discuss it, you guys. The lives of the Caesars, or the 12 Caesars, from Julius to Domitian, which is about AD 96. So this is the early, Anno Domini, right? First century AD. The work is preserved except for a few chapters of Julius's life. Pretty cool, right? Let's see. Suetonius was aware that he must strike out in a different direction from the writers of history, which was regarded as a different genre. This seemed all the more important for Suetonius because of the overpowering contemporary work of Tacitus, which I just discussed, which could not be rivaled. In consequence, he abandoned the chronological method, which the Greek fellow biographer Plutarch tended to favor. Plutarch is right. I just had my Plutarch book. Plutarch is, it's right up there. Anyway, I just read Plutarch about a year ago. Plutarch tended to favor and adopted a method which had occasionally been employed in Greek and Latin before, whereby the straight narrative was interrupted by material classified according to subject matter, dealing successively with the different characteristics which the personages played. In this procedure of classification, it may be possible to direct the expert on grammar and grammarians. So that's why we're doing literature, right? That's why we're doing this on a literary stream. Suetonius' principal contribution, however, lies in his relatively high degree of objectivity, which is funny because he's objective in this, in the sense that he he tells sort of good and bad things about the emperors. He does sort of a both sides sort of thing, right? However, he clearly offers his opinion. I'm glad he does. He clearly offers his opinion on certain matters. He doesn't just tell it in a completely dispassionate, objective, boring sense. That's what makes the book good. This book, it really is amazing. I mean, it's like reading a contemporary history / scandalous novel of the most insane people who are real people. And let's see. With him, we have moved away from the traditional eulogistic treatment, and we have entered a much more astringent atmosphere in which the men whom he is describing, are looking at with a cooler and more disenchanted eye. Owing to our losses in earlier literature, it's impossible to state with any assurance whether and to what extent this had been achieved by previous writers, but at all events, Suetonius innovated by selecting the rulers of Rome as targets for his exercise. He gathers together and lavishly inserts information both for and against them, usually without adding any personal judgment in one direction or the other. I disagree. He does do that. This has the result, since he loves an entertaining story, that eccentricities rather than virtues remain in the reader's mind. And boy, do they. So we're not getting some sort of, glossed over, polished history of the Roman Empire. We're getting we're getting the viewpoint of a normal dude, a high IQ dude with a sense of Roman virtue, at least, who's going to give us some pretty amazing and fantastic anecdotes about these guys. It says, it's weird and fascinating material. Perhaps he may feel that this is how people are. They possess discordant elements which do not add up to a harmonious unity, which sounds Aristotelian. But what that means is that we're discussing Roman emperors who he does humanize them, okay, but the stories that he tells are wild. Okay, so I know you're tired of me saying that they're wild and you want to just hear the stories. So let's see here. A couple more things. The best quality of his work is his power to create rapid, dramatic, and often moving narrative, including at times impressive set pieces, among which the death of Nero is especially notable. Nero is kind of the climax of this book. I mean, the stuff on Nero is so amazing. An unusual, if not unprecedented feature is his willingness to quote verbatim from his sources, offering literal citations from imperial letters and public and private records. So what we get from this book is a historical tradition whereby we have primary sources and quoted material, both in a historical tradition and in a literary analysis tradition, where he's going to cite, he's going to self-reference, he's going to reference other people, he's going to give specific citations. And remember that, keep in mind, people often forget that, Corbett has talked about the new library at Alexandria, is his term, right? What that means essentially is that it's important to archive material, especially the important material and the salacious stuff that happens now in our day, right? because it obviously gets disappeared. It gets 1984'd. People get unpersoned, and even the Wayback Machine is subject to this now, apparently. But what that means is that it's important to preserve stuff, because if the Internet of Things and the great reset of the internet occurs and everything disappears in that sense, it's amazing how fast people forget. I mean, we all know this. People forget events, major events. They forget events that are happening now, currently. They're unaware. So you think people are going to remember the major events, you know what I'm talking about, that happened a week ago, a month ago, a year, 2 years ago, etc. So it's important to keep in mind that this actually did happen, right? The great, the new library at Alexandria is sort of a catch-all term for something that did happen. And what that means is that a lot of this material that, this was just referenced in the intro, we would have no knowledge of this, right, if it weren't for certain people with discernment and forethought and some virtue to save the actual scrolls and to hide them away for a couple hundred years. If we didn't have monks who copied every single word of a text, right? That's why we have Aristotle. That's why we have fragments of Sappho. That's why we have Suetonius. That's why we have Tacitus, because there was a point in history where the Roman Empire fell and the entire known world, in a sense, at least in the West, right? All of the learned material, not all of it, but most of the learned material, it disappeared. It's gone, right? And so thankfully we have this. And so I think it's important to read this just as a statement for what's happening now, in a sense, if that makes any sense. This says, the documentary material, however, is almost entirely limited to Augustus. So it was probably after writing that emperor's biography that the second of the 12 in this book, that he was dismissed from court and consequently lost access to the archives. In other words, Suetonius was working under Augustus. He didn't like what he had to say about some things. He was dismissed. We just read about this, of course, in relation to Virgil, who was Dante's guide in the Inferno. Go back and watch my Inferno stream. I thought we did a good job with that one, guys. I hope it does well. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I know this is more dark material, but I think it's fun in a lot of ways. But anyway, that did happen to Virgil under Augustus. Remember, Virgil was the court poet of Augustus, and then he was dismissed. He was exiled. Let's see. The period in which Suetonius is writing is one of the most important, critical, and formative in the history of the Western world, with the exception of the Greek Dio Cassius, who is much later incomplete and often anachronistic. Suetonius and Tacitus are our only major literary sources for the epic. That's crazy. Certainly modern methods are out of sympathy and Suetonius' Caesar-oriented, palace-centered approach, and there is admittedly a danger that by accepting it too slavishly, we shall forget all the more important things that are happening in the other parts of the empire. On the other hand, the current reaction against his concentration on imperial personalities has gone too far, so far indeed that we've been told that the emperors did not matter very greatly and that the Roman world would have manifested much the same trends and developments without them. This is, however, highly questionable, which is what I just said in the intro. Granted that the Republic would still have broken down had Caesar never existed, the autocracy which followed might have assumed a very different form had there not been an Augustus, and Claudius and Vespasian too fulfilled highly individual and influential roles. It is only from Suetonius that we get a plausible idea of what sort of people they were. His 12 Caesars provided a model for Einhard's Charlemagne in the 9th century and a source for Petrarch's Lives of the Illustrious Romans in the 14th. Let's see. And also, obviously, this edition is translated by Robert Graves, if you remember Robert Graves, who is the author of the notable book, I, Claudius. Let's see. It says, I've had the same experience. Indeed, this is clear enough from this version, which makes vivid and compulsive reading and conveys the peculiarities of Suetonius' methods and character better than any other translation. Why, this guy says, Michael Grant says, why then have I been asked to edit it? Because Robert Graves, who explicitly refrained from catering for students, did not aim to produce a precise translation, introducing, as he himself points out, sentences of explanation, omitting passages which do not seem to help the sense, and turning sentences and sometimes even groups of sentences inside out. What that means is that it's just a statement on the syntax and his translation method. All right, so we start off with Julius Caesar. So what I'm going to do is go through the 12 Caesars. I'm actually really going to go through about 6. Crispy says, I got a question for Based. If anyone wants to pay Piggy and hasn't gotten a question. Yeah, send me those pay piggies, you guys. Send me those fat chats. And shouts out to the people that supported me on the last stream. I really appreciate you. Shouts out to Rachel, Based Homeschool Mom, of course. Shouts out to Kristen. Shouts out to Derek. Shouts out to, let's see, I had a couple other ones. Shouts out to Kim. Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Shouts out to, let's see. This Robert Terry. Thank you so much. So yeah, go ahead and send me those fat chats, guys. Cash App, PayPal, and Venmo. I really appreciate you. It helps me to do the streams. We're gonna keep going. And like I said in the last one, we always need more books. That's what the stream's about, right? And shouts out to everybody out there who's joining me on this nice Sunday night. Shouts out to Mixkey in the chat there. I see you, homeboy. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through the first 6 Caesars and talk about. I'm going to quote from the text as always. We're going to look at form and content and discuss how he writes the book. Shouts out to Ellie out there, who is working on something big, you guys. And I think pretty soon you're going to be really happy with the way that the stream looks and sounds, because we got a couple of our homies working on some stuff. So more about that later. Shouts out to my homeboy Jeff, of course, as always. Let's see. Okay, so Julius Caesar talks about his early life, and Caesar sort of came up under the dictatorship of Sulla. We don't have enough time to talk about Sulla himself, but Sulla is one of the monumental figures of Roman history and, of course, of the Roman Republic. Rome is mirrored in the British Empire, especially in the American experience, in a number of ways, right? It is a monarchy, right? Begins as a monarchy, becomes a republic, and then ends up as an empire, as we have there. No one's going to say that, but it has. There's actually a quote about that later on when one of the later emperors, it's Domitian, talks about the idea of conspiracy. We're going to get into that at the very end. But he grew up under the dictatorship of Sulla. It was a huge figure. Caesar, of course, had health issues. He was an epileptic, court and fever. On page 2 here, it says, meanwhile, let's see, and was captured by pirates off of the island of Parmacusa. They kept him prisoner for nearly 40 days to his intense annoyance. He had with him only a physician and 2 valets. As soon as the stipulated 50 talents arrived, which make 12,000 gold pieces, and the pirates duly set him ashore, he raised a fleet and went after them. He had often smilingly sworn, while still in their power, that he would soon capture and crucify them, and this is exactly what he did. Then he continued to Rhodes, and Mithridates was now ravaging the nearby coast of Asia Minor. So to avoid the charge of showing inertia while the allies of Rome were in danger, he raised a force of irregulars and drove Mithridates' power from the province, which confirmed the timorous and half-hearted cities of Asia in their allegiance. Let's see. On Caesar's return to Rome, the assembly voted him the rank of colonel, and he vigorously helped their leaders to undo Sulla's legislation by restoring the tribunes of the people to their ancient powers. Then it goes on to describe his rise to power. He went and conquered Spain. Let's see. At Questor, Caesar was appointed to further Spain, where the governor sent him off to an assize circuit. At Gades, he saw a statue of Alexander the Great in the Temple of Hercules and was overheard to sigh impatiently vexed, it seems, that an age when Alexander had already conquered the whole world, he himself had done nothing in the least epic making. Now, that's a mirror, a clever mirror of what Alexander said, right? When he got to where was he at the gates after he crossed the Hindu Kush? And Alexander wept because he had no more worlds to conquer. Well, Caesar says sort of the inverse. And Caesar sort of models himself on Alexander the Great in a number of ways. And it's, debatable whether he surpassed Alexander. But it says, let's see. Moreover, when on the following night, much to his dismay, he had a dream of Raping, his own mother. The soothsayers greatly encouraged him by their interpretation of it, namely that he was destined to conquer the earth, our universal mother. There's a lot about dreams, omens, portents in this. They play a huge role in the cultic Roman religion. We're going to get into that. Let's see. Caesar goes on to go through a number of shenanigans. Essentially, he tries to secure the goodwill of the public and their tribunes by gaining control of Egypt by popular vote. In Egypt, the Alexandrians had just opposed King Ptolemy. Caesar put on gladiatorial shows. He was all of these guys, are lawgivers, essentially, right? They're all lawyers. And they always talk about them prosecuting cases. He gets continuous death threats. Caesar is born in a very extremely well-to-do family. He's an elite. But it's his rise to power that is essentially what sets him on the course for his eventual assassination. It talks about his first triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus. And let's see. The aristocratic party got wind of their arrangement, and fearing that if Caesar were elected consul with a pliant colleague by his side, he would stop at nothing to gain his own end. Cato admitted that this was an occasion when even bribery might be excused as a legitimate means of preserving the Constitution. Hello? Does that not sound current? Bribery is unethical, except when we have to preserve the Constitution in certain cases, right? 55? Hell no, I ain't no 55. I'm 41. Let's see. Jeff trying to get me. Let's see. Caesar surveyed the many provinces open to him and chose Gaul as being the likeliest to supply him with wealth and triumph. So he goes and conquers Gaul. He, let's see, some notes here. The governorships of various. So Caesar is a great example of the sort of elite power structure that we still see now, which can best be exemplified by the boarding school, private school system, and by the British public school system, which is that, right, the elite families have their boys. They send them off at 5 years old. They are taken away from any sort of motherly instinct, right? They are made to be hard. They sort of, you could say this is a sort of a psychopathic system in nature, right? Then they graduate from Harrow or Eton or, Phillips Exeter, et cetera, and they are sent off to, to the universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, et cetera. Then they either go to law school, business school, et cetera, or are sent off to be administrators in the various far-flung reaches of the empire in the banking industry, oil, steel, the industry, or in the ranks of the military officers, or in politics as governors, right? Which sort of builds their power base and is part of the old boy network. They have these intrigues with each other. They come back and then continue to run the empire from central Walmart locales. I being from the South live in a Walmart. Others choose the Google City lifestyle or Target. um, Shouts out to JD. All right, so let's see. He invades Britain, a hitherto unknown country. He began building a new forum in Rome. He fixed the daily pay of his soldiers. Don't knock that over. No, sorry. Dog knocking the light over, y'all. And let's see. He frankly told such people, what you need is a civil war. Pompey, when he introduced a bill regulating the, and it's Pompey, but we've discussed this before, but it's Pompey, Pompey, the historical character, the great general. Pompey the Great is Pompey, not Pompeii. The city is Pompeii. The man is Pompey, right? Pompey, when he introduced a bill regulating the privileges of state officials, had omitted to make a special exception for Caesar in the clause debarring absentees from candidacy. So he uses his knowledge of the law and of the political system in order to gain control. Caesar is resolved to invade Italy by force if force were used against the tribunes of the people, and force was in effect used, and the tribunes fled toward Gaul, which became Caesar's pretext for launching his civil war. Pompey's comment was that because Caesar had insufficient capital to carry out his grandiose schemes or give the people all that they had been encouraged to expect on his return, he chose to create an atmosphere of political confusion. It's also been suggested that the constant exercise of power gave Caesar a love of it. So what happens with Caesar, which is what we discussed in the Julius Caesar, Shakespeare Julius Caesar stream, is that Caesar essentially goes off and he conquers, the outer reaches of the empire. He absorbs these wild, barbarian places into the empire. And then while he's gone, they say, okay, he has too much power, bring him back. They get Pompey to bring him back. But they say, when you come back, you got to lay down your arms. Caesar won't do that. He's been with his men for like 10 years. He comes to obviously the famous Rubicon. And remember, we just said that in Dante's Inferno, right? The guy who was with him who said, yeah, go on, do it. Go on, get Rome. That guy ended up in hell. But Caesar says, Ilia iacta est, right? The die is cast. And he goes in and he invades Italy from the north. There's a civil war against Pompey. Pompey takes off. He is later decapitated by, I forget who, Mithridates or somebody. And Caesar wins the war. Obviously, he's proclaimed dictator for life, which is not unusual in Rome, following the example of Sulla, really. They try to proclaim him king 3 times. He denies the crown. And then we go through the whole deal with Brutus and Cassius. Let's see. This talks about Pompey. Yeah, Pompey fled to Alexandria. Caesar followed. And when he found out that, it was Ptolemy the 13th had murdered Pompey and was planning to murder him as well, he declared war. Caesar was victorious. He then handed over the government of Egypt to Queen Cleopatra. Caesar made his way to North Africa, and he beat Scipio and King Juba in North Africa. Scipio is also an amazing character to read about. Scipio Africanus, of course, is the one who beat Hannibal, right? Let's see. It says throughout the Civil War. See, it's itemized. The book is kind of itemized in a way. Like the paragraphs are sort of, the sections are numbered, which is pretty cool. Throughout the Civil War, Caesar was never defeated himself, but his generals were killed fighting in North Africa. Caesar remarked that when Pompey failed to pursue him, he does not know how to win wars, which is crazy because remember, Caesar ended up falling at the feet of the statue of Pompey. And Pompey was the great. Pompey was one of the great generals of history. But of course, it comes down to Caesar to say that Pompey doesn't know how to win wars. And let's see, he comes back to Rome and he says, of course, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. I came, I saw, he died. Shut up. Caesar eliminates the decadent tendencies by the populace. I'm not really going to get into that part because there's too much to cover. Talking about his health. He had all these public works in place for before he died, for renovating the city of Rome and doing these massive public works projects. Yeah, it makes all these schemes were canceled by his assassination. Here's on his health. Let's see. Caesar is said to have been tall, fair, and well built, with a rather broad face and keen, dark brown eyes. His health was sound, apart from sudden comas and a tendency to nightmares, which troubled him towards the end of his life. But he twice had epileptic fits while on campaign. He was something of a dandy, Suetonius says, always keeping his head carefully trimmed and shaved, and has been accused of having certain other hairy parts of his body depilated with tweezers. Oh boy. Scandalous to read this. Suetonius really gets into talking about the personal life, right? But it's interesting. He talks about the Caesar dude, right? You got a Caesar dude. What's that song by Dirt Nasty where he talks about the Caesar dude? Remember the Caesar dude, you guys? Remember that? Well, you may not remember. First of all, you may not have been alive at the time with us old fellers here. But there was a time back in the early 90s when George Clooney popularized the Caesar do. That was when he became popular, right? Remember, he was on ER in the early 90s and he had the combed forward, brushed forward Caesar haircut. That was kind of a cool little blip in a weird fad. You know, that was kind of a cool haircut, I think, the Caesar do. Let's see. Pearls seem to have been the lure that prompted his invasion of Britain. He invaded Britain for pearls. Of course, they also had tin. Britain was the Tin Isles, right? He would sometimes weigh them in the palm of his hand to judge their value, and was also a keen collector of old gems, carvings, statues, and the old masters. He sounds a lot like Goering there, actually, because Goering was known. There's a passage in not Ian Kershaw's book, Evans, the book by Evans, the historian Evans, about the coming of the third Reich, where they talk about when people would go to visit Goering at it was called Karen Hall. It was this massive hunting estate that he built in honor of his deceased wife. He called it Karen. Name was Karen, Carin. But obviously Goering had stolen all of the old masters and all the great artwork and filled Karen Hall up with them. And he also stole all these jewels, and people would come in and there's one passage I remember where they discussed that Goering was seated on a throne. He was seated on Charlemagne's throne or something at the end of this hall with a green medieval hunting tunic. And he had bowls on either side of the throne, one filled with like rubies and one filled with diamonds, and he would just like run his fingers through the gems while he held court and had an audience or whatever. All while, of course, he was on morphine. So that this passage reminded me of that. Page 23. The only specific charge of unnatural practices ever brought against Julius Caesar, was that he had been King Nicomedes' bedfellow. Always a dark stain on his reputation and frequently quoted by his enemies. But on page 25, it says his affairs with women are commonly described as numerous and extravagant. The most famous of the queens that he seduced, of course, was Cleopatra of Egypt. And he acknowledged his son with Cleopatra. Now, his son was eventually killed, but his son was named Caesarion, right? Which is where you get the Caesarian section, the C-section. But remember my Macbeth stream? We talked about that a lot in the Macbeth stream, right? Shall not be killed by one who is not a woman born. But think of Caesarion. I mean, think of how big this guy would have been, right? The son of Cleopatra and Caesar, if he had not have been killed, of course, in the midst of the ongoing machinations of these people. I think he was killed by not maybe it was Augustus because he was obviously a rival to Augustus when Augustus was ascending to the imperial throne. Augustus was Octavian. He was the grand nephew of Caesar. We'll get to that. Let's see. To emphasize the bad name Caesar had won alike for unnatural and natural vice. Obviously, that's a code word for those kinds of relationships. I may here record that the elder Curio referred to him in a speech as every woman's man and every man's woman. Oh, snaps. Talks about how he was not particularly honest in money matters. He sacked several Lusitanian towns, etc. Of course, all these guys, even today, when you look at intelligence, right, and the power structure today, of course, they're not scrupulous in their money matters on a massive scale. remember Don Rumsfeld on 9/10/2001, that hearing. Sir, where is that $8 billion? Caesar equaled, if he did not surpass, the greatest orators and generals the world has ever known. Said, this is a quote from Cornelius Nepos of the time. No, from Cicero. Cicero wrote, very well, then, do you know any man who, even if he has concentrated on the art of oratory to the exclusion of all else, can speak better than Caesar? That's high praise coming from Cicero, of all people. Or anyone who makes so many witty remarks, or whose vocabulary is so varied and yet so exact. It is said that he pitched his voice high in speaking and used impassioned gestures, which far from displeased his audience. That reminds me of Hotler giving speeches, right? Of course, Hotler was in a lot of ways copying Mussolini, who saw himself as the new Caesar, right? Caesar wrote well. Of course, you can still read Caesar's books. His memoirs on Gaul, etc. This says Caesar wrote admirably. This is Cicero again, said Caesar wrote admirably. His memoirs are cleanly, directly, and gracefully composed and divested of all rhetorical trappings. And while his sole intention was to supply historians with factual material, the result has been that several fools have been pleased to primp up his narrative for their own glorification, but every writer of sense has given the subject a wide berth. Caesar wrote in cipher. At times, a lot of the emperors will write in cipher. They will develop their own cipher and write in cipher. He was the most skilled swordsman and horseman. He often arrived at his destination before the messengers whom he had sent ahead to announce his approach. Page 29, this is an important part. It says, it is a disputable point which was the more remarkable when he went to war, his caution or his daring, right? He never exposed his army to ambushes, but made careful reconnaissances and refrained from crossing over into Britain until he had collected reliable information about the harbors there, the best course to steer, and the navigational risks. On the other hand, when news reached him that his camp in Germany was being besieged, he disguised himself as a Gaul and picked his way through the enemy outpost to take command on the spot. See, obviously, there's not really much more that needs to be said, but Caesar, one of the greatest generals of all time, right? And that's not hyperbole. Says, he had a habit, because he was so clever, he had a habit of turning unfavorable omens into favorable instances. So, for instance, there was an unfavorable omen. He was like he got to Egypt and he was disembarking from a ship, and he fell off into the water. And of course, everybody saw that as a bad omen. They said, "Oh no, we're going to fail here. Caesar's going to fall. Run, the African colonies are going to fall." And Caesar got up and said, and stood firmly on the ground and said, "Africa, I have tight hold of you." And somehow everybody laughed and they said, "Oh no, he fell. He didn't fall off the boat. He fell into Africa." Talks about his horse. There's one other horse we're going to read about in this, which is pretty funny. This charger of his, an extraordinary animal with feet that looked almost human. Caesar's horse. Caesar's horse had feet that looked human. Each of its hooves was cloven in 5 parts resembling human toes, who had been foaled on his private estate. When the soothsayers pronounced that its master would one day rule the world, Caesar carefully reared and was the first to ride the beast, nor would it allow anyone else to do so. Eventually, he raised a statue to it before the temple of Mother Venus, because the Caesars said that they were directly descended from Venus, the goddess Venus, is what Julius Caesar said. Let's see. It was his practice to heighten morale, not by denying or belittling danger, but on the contrary, by further exaggerating it. So when his troops were going to attack King Juba, they said, oh, man, he walked amongst them, kind of like Henry V does. Shakespeare probably stole this directly from accounts of Caesar. But Henry V, formerly Hal, cloaks himself in the guise of a common soldier and goes out and walks amongst his men. And they don't know that it's Henry, and he can hear them sort of gossiping and talking, and they're saying like, oh no, we're up against a superior force. I don't know if we're going to win this one. And Caesar would counter that by saying, he wouldn't say, no, we're going to win and give a speech. He would say, no, we're probably going to lose. You're right. These people are vicious. There's not 30,000 of them. There's 60,000. He would hype it up so that their sense of, tomorrow we ride. We ride at dawn. Tomorrow we shall ride at 9. We will get up at the crack of at 9:30. 10. We rise at 9. We depart at 10. Tomorrow we ride. Well, what's the other part? What does he say in Gladiator? Riding. Keep riding. And if you wake up in Elysium, it means you are already dead. And they laugh. Let's see. What we do in life echoes in his. Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Is that not why you are here? He becomes sort of Arnold Schwarzenegger in that. Have you ever noticed that? Because he's Australian. Well, no, actually, he's a Kiwi, but you're right. But because he's, Russell Crowe, is that not why you are here? Why are you here? It starts to sound like Arnold in that part. Let's see. Even as a young man, Caesar was well known for his devotion and loyalty. He showed his dependents and his soldiers, page 33. Caesar was not naturally vindictive, page 34. This part was brilliant. On page 35, nobody can deny that during the Civil Wars, this is section 75 on page 35 of the Seutonius book. Nobody can deny that during the Civil War and after, he behaved with wonderful restraint and clemency, whereas Pompey declared that all who were not actively with the government were against. Okay, so Pompey declares that all who are not actively with the government are against it and would be treated as public enemies. Caesar announces that all who are not actively against him were with him. That's pretty brilliant, right? I mean, you can see that in the W speech, right? You're either with the Turkish or you're with us, right? Okay. But what if you're not totally with that, right? He just turned it around, basically. That Henry Lee Lucas. I got to tell you, that Henry Lee Lucas, she's a good boy. What did Jeff say last night? Big honey bun's been lying to you. He also preferred to discourage rather than punish any plots against his life or any slanders on his name. I guess so, because he had so many plots on his name. He was always there was always a plot against him. Of course, in the end, it got him, right? Okay, go into Caesar's honors and his how he subverts omens. Of course, Shakespeare demonstrates that in Julius Caesar again. He talked about how the night before the assassination, his wife, Calpurnius, she says, don't go to the forum, right? I had this dream of there's a statue of you and it was just showering blood, right? don't go to the forum. There's holes all in the body, in the statue. And Caesar says, no, that's not what you dreamed. I mean, you dreamed that, but what you dream is that I'm not going to be stabbed. The dream is essentially that I'm the statue because I am Rome, and my blood, the blood that flows in my veins, is the blood of the lifeblood of Rome. So I'm feeding the Roman people with my lifeblood. And she was like, okay, I still don't think you should go. And then like later that day, she's like, yeah, I should have listened to me, dumbass. I might skip some of these. This goes into pages 40 and 41, talks about the assassination of Caesar, which we've covered in detail in the Julius Caesar stream. It's essentially exactly like it is in Shakespeare. It's just lifted. Caesar always said that he wanted a sudden death. On page 43, section 87, almost all authorities agree on one thing, that he more or less welcomed the manner of his death. He had once read in Xenophon's Boyhood of Cyrus the virus. The last thing you see will be the flies buzzing around your rotting corpses. Cyrus the Great. The paragraph about the funeral instructions given by Cyrus on his deathbed, and said how much he loathed the prospect of lingering end. He wanted a sudden one, of course, so it doesn't anybody. And on the day before his murder, he had dined at Marcus Lepidus's house, the other member of the triumvirate, Lepidus. Lepidus was a real dumbass. He was like an older guy and not really great at military, but he was really rich. So Caesar and Pompey. So later Lepidus is in the second triumvirate with Mark Antony and Octavian, but Octavian and Antony are like, this guy's just here. We're gonna get rid of him. It says, where the topic discussed happened to be the best sort of death, and let it come swiftly and unexpectedly, cried Caesar. I like how Seutonius relates this sort of, it's relatable material and it's matter of fact, because listen, when dudes are being dudes, they do sit around and talk about that, right, y'all? What is the best manner of death? Remember in The Naked Gun? Have your parachute not open. That's the way I want to go. Get caught in the gears of a combine. When OJ is sitting there on the hospital bed. Let's see. There was a comet that appeared an hour before sunset and shone for 7 days running. They said this was on the day of his death, and they said this was his apotheosis. Okay, so next we're going to go into Augustus. Augustus is the former Octavian, and he obviously rules for the longest of any of these guys. Augustus, of course, when Augustus takes power, he's not an emperor. And of course, I know you know this, but Caesar is a byword for emperor, right? Because Julius Caesar was his name. Of course, Julius Caesar becomes the dictator. He dies, and then Augustus ascends and then defeats Antony in all the stuff that follows in the new civil war. And then eventually he becomes Imperator, and then so he's emperor, and his name is Caesar. So Caesar is synonymous with emperor. That's where you get the Kaiser, right? Kaiser Sose, and it's where you get the Czar, right? They are Caesars or new Caesars. See, I had did I have a super chat in here? I think I did. Somebody dropped a cash. Oh, Kristen sent me $5. Thank you, Kristen. Appreciate you, Kristen, as always. Yeah, you guys, come on. Drop your old boy here, some fat chats here. Come on now. Thank you for being with me here. I appreciate you. I always appreciate y'all being with me here. And thank you, especially to everybody who's watching this later. And if you're watching this later, please just hit that subscribe button, okay? I do these all the time. You can hear my little raspy voice talking about literature all the time. We do a few of these a week. And if you want me to cover something, if there's especially something you want me to cover, drop me some moolah, drop me some cheese, right? Drop me mo cheese, drop me some fat chats, Cash App, PayPal, Venmo. It's very easy. Drop me a few bucks, drop me a lot of bucks if you want. And I will cover something you want me to cover. I will help you with writing if that's what you do. I will do whatever. in terms of literature or literary analysis. And I certainly appreciate it. I always appreciate you guys, and I appreciate you so much. And I thank you out there. So yes, if you want me to do something, you want me to read your comments, or you got questions, ask me some questions. I might know the answer. I know a lot of wild, weird stuff. I've got a mind for Jeopardy material. Ask me some questions. Maybe I can answer it. Let's see. This talks about sacrifice. There's a lot about human sacrifice. Apparently, news of an attack by a neighboring city reached him while he was sacrificing a victim to Mars. This is Augustus. Snatching the intestines from the fire, he offered them only half burned and hurried away to win the battle. The records at Velitrae included a decree that all future offerings to Mars must be made in the same fashion, the carcass of every victim being a prerequisite for the Octavians. What's the book on the left? Which book? Which book? Which left? My left or your left? This left? Which book? Ask me, Chris. Let's see. Octavian actually was also not his original name. His name when he was born was Tyrannus. Let's see. He was adopted. He adopted the name Caesar to comply with the will of his mother's uncle, the dictator, and then the title Augustus. The name Augustus obviously comes from August, right? Since sanctuaries in all places consecrated by the augurs, right? So of course the augury, right? Augury, divination, sorcery are all inherent to the Roman cultic religion. And the augurs, right, gave us the name August, and then that gave us Augustus. That's that book is a biography of Charles Manson by a guy named Gunn. It's pretty good. It's called The Life and Times of Charles Manson by Jeff Gunn. Yeah, it's pretty good. I would say that, and the new biography of Charles Manson. I would probably start with that one. Unless if you haven't read Helter Skelter out there by Vincent Bugliosi, I definitely recommend that, even though obviously it's probably mostly bullshit. But however, it is important to read that for an understanding of the generally accepted narrative. We've talked about Helter Skelter before here, right? It's got that famous epigraph. The book you're about to read will scare the hell out of you. It's the one that I read. My English teacher wouldn't let me read in 6th grade. And then my cool English teacher let me read in 7th grade. He said, hell yeah, man, go ahead and read it. That lady, she's the one who said, no, you can't read that. Go read Treasure Island. And Treasure Island's fine too. I got that copy of Treasure Island right down there. That's fine too. But come on now. Right? I was trying to be based as a 6th grader. Let's see, page 49, section 10. The underlying motive of every military campaign that Augustus did was because he felt it was his duty above all to avenge Caesar and keep his decrees in force. And Augustus actually engaged assassins to murder Antony. This book is harsh on Mark Antony, by the way. It sort of changes my perspective on Mark Antony. I mean, say what you will about Mark Antony and how he's the ultimate political operative and opportunist, even in Shakespeare's Caesar. He's clearly doing in Shakespeare's Caesar, Mark Antony is clearly doing what he's been instructed to do in terms of his political life instruction by his mentor, his master, Julius Caesar, upon his death, right? He's seizing the reins of control. Perhaps you feel the dint of pity, right? I must pause, right? He has to pause. And then that scene in the film, Marlon Brando turns around. He's clearly not crying, right? Which shows that it's all an act. But this book is harsh on him because he's essentially a guy. I mean, he's just an infinite gossip. And eventually, of course, it gets him killed. You know, his mouth writes a check his ass can't handle, right? He shouldn't have quit his day job. He goes off and he lives with Cleopatra, right, who was his master's lover. He goes and lives with Cleopatra for like 12 years in Egypt. He fights Octavian. He tries to wrestle the reins of control. And Mark Antony was a extremely popular guy. He was obviously one of the great orators of all time. He was handsome. He was athletic. He was popular. He did all the right stuff, but his intrigues were too much. And Augustus or Octavian was just simply too cold and too powerful for him. And he ended up dead. Right. And Augustus obviously reigned for a long time. Remember that Augustus was the emperor during the birth of Christ, and Tiberius was the emperor during the crucifixion of Christ. If only Tiberius could have learned a little bit and not been such a fucking pervert. We're going to get into Tiberius next. But man, did he ever need to, if he could have just gone down to Jerusalem, right? Let's see. Augustus defeats, on page 54, Augustus defeats Antony and kills Caesarion. He turned the kingdom of Egypt into a Roman province. I thought that was apt or apropos for now, right? Because that's what the American empire continues to do. Turn these far-flung places into colonies. Of course, they don't say that, but what do you think is happening now? In that place, in that part of the world, obviously. Let's see. Next. There's page 58. I've found particularly fascinating the parts about Agrippa. I've always loved reading about Agrippa mainly because of the Pantheon in Rome. If you ever get to go to Rome, and the Pantheon is one of the main places you go, and it's got Agrippa's name right on the front, which I think is really cool. And Agrippa was also a great general. Let's see. Augustus would quote Greek proverbs such as "more haste, less," wise words, and the Latin tag "well done is quickly done." Then they went back to the Senate, and he said, if you did not, one of his guys, Cornelius, says, if you do not make him consul, the consul is the ultimate. It's the system of essentially the dual electors in Rome, which is what we had leading up to the January event of 2021, a system of dual electors, right? But that was their actual implemented legal system. They would have two consuls, right? And the consul was like sort of the president, but there were two of them, and they would keep each other in check. That's why Pompey and Caesar, right? But one of the guys says, if you don't make Augustus consul, this will, and he points at his at the hilt of his sword. For 10 years, Augustus remained a member of the Triumvirate, commissioned to reorganize the government. He carried it out more ruthlessly than either of them, meaning Mark Antony or Lepidus. Augustus alone demanded that no one be spared. He was completely ruthless. Remember that scene in Julius Caesar? Look, with a spot, I damn him. They have a hit list. And Augustus and Mark Antony trade relatives who were to be assassinated. On page 60, it says, once, for instance, while addressing a soldiers' assembly at which a crowd of civilians were also present, this guy saw a Roman knight named Pinarius transcribing his speech, and Augustus had him stabbed there and then as taking too close an interest in the proceedings. Another time, this guy Gallius was tortured as if he were a slave, and though he confessed to nothing, Augustus himself tore out his eyes and sentenced him to death. On page 61, on reconsideration, however, for another guy, he decided that to divide the responsibilities of government among several. Augustus was going to divide the government and make it a republic again, but he said it was too risky and that it would jeopardize not only his life, but national security, Robert Graves says in his translation of Suetonius. Uses the term national security. So he did not do so. I found Rome built of bricks. I leave her clothed in marble. He builds the empire. And then the Pantheon by Marcus Agrippa. All right, so eventually, let's see. we get to Augustus's private life on page 81. He got married. He got married, and then he got quickly divorced to this lady Scribonia because, as he wrote, I could not bear the way she nagged at me. Right? It reads like it's cool because it reads like current day, doesn't it? At Agrippa's death, Augustus cast about for a new son-in-law, even if he were only in. I just think that humanizes him. Is all I'm saying. I'm not saying this. I'm not saying it's good, people. I'm just saying that's what he said. Okay. Augustus cast about for a new son-in-law, even if he were only a knight, eventually choosing Tiberius, his stepson. Oh boy, wait till we get to Tiberius. You know what? Let's go ahead and get to Tiberius. A couple more things. This talks about his creeper behavior. Let's see. They would sacrifice humans to sacrifice. Oh, Lucius added that after sacrificing his Antony's brother Lucius added that. Okay. So here we go. Mark Antony alleged that Julius Caesar made Augustus submit to unnatural relations as the price of adoption. Creeper behavior. Antony's brother Lucius, now we don't know whether to believe Antony because he's an eternal gossip, but Lucius added that after sacrificing his virtue to Caesar, Augustus had sold his favors to Aulus Hirtius in Spain for 3,000 gold pieces, and that he used to soften the hair on his legs by singeing them with red-hot walnut shells. Let's see. This guy Tyrannus. Oh, this is bad. On page 86, was basically Augustus's pimp, and but not even just pimp. In arranging his pleasures for him, they would strip mothers of families or grown girls of their clothes and inspect them as though they were up for sale. And then he would well, yeah, you know. Page 87, Augustus easily disproved the accusation or slander, if you like, of prostituting his body to men by the decent normality of his sex life then and later. I don't know. He did like to have normal fun. He would hang out with his friends and play dice and stuff. It says he was 5'7". Augustus' eyes on page 92 were clear and bright, and he liked to believe that they shone with sort of divine radiance. It gave him profound pleasure if anyone at whom he glanced keenly dropped his head as though dazzled by looking into the sun. These people. Then it talks about Augustus's writing style, and Augustus wrote poems. He wrote a major tragedy called Ajax, but destroyed it. And he would often comment on the writing of his relatives. He would you can still read the letters. It's crazy, right? You can still read the letters between Augustus and various members of his family, including the younger ones. And he wrote back to his granddaughter Agrippina, please take care to avoid affectation in writing or talking. He would criticize Cato. Are you trying to acclimatize in Latin the nonsensicalities of those garrulous Asiatic orators? He said Mark Antony was for Augustus a madman who wrote as though he wanted to be wondered at rather than understood. He disliked innovation in writing and archaizers. And his main object was to say what he wanted as plainly as possible. He would often weigh his words. It talks about his dreams and various prodigies and superstitions. Augustus had absolute faith in certain premonitory signs, considering it bad luck to thrust his right foot into his left shoe as he got out of bed, but good luck to start a journey or voyage during a drizzle of rain. Well, that's what sailors believe. He became an adept at the Eleusinian mysteries at Athens. And here's a part about a serpent. This is page 99 in the book. There's a story which I found in a book called Theologia by Asclepiades of Mendes. Augustus' mother, Atia, with certain married women friends, once attended a solemn midnight service at the Temple of Apollo, where she had her litter set down and presently fell asleep, as the others also did. Suddenly, a serpent glided up, and here we go. Suddenly, a serpent glided up, entered her, and then glided away again. On awakening, she purified herself as if after intimacy with her husband. An irremovable colored mark in the shape of a serpent, which then appeared on her body, made her ashamed to visit the public baths anymore. And the birth of Augustus 9 months later suggested a divine paternity. Attia dreamed that her intestines were carried up to heaven and overhung all lands and seas, and Octavius that the sun rose from between her thighs. Oh boy, yeah. So she was violated by a serpent. And in her weird cultic, you see why these people had to go, right? And talks about how Augustus would go to a grove sacred to Father Liber, right? Like Al Crowley's, what's his book? Liber, I forget the full name. Liber. Anyway, I forgot. But they celebrated certain barbaric rites, including human sacrifice. Also, the image of the serpent on her inner thigh reminds me of that cult. It's like OTO Temple Set. There's the AA, the Astra Argentium, and then there's the Order of the Silver Serpent. And let's see. Okay, so eventually Augustus dies. And it talks about all of the various, he dies fairly peacefully. And when he died, his last words, "May heaven grant the same euthanasia to me and mine." He's used the word euthanasia, of course, because he's sort of put out of his misery. All right, so I'm just going to now briefly talk about just the most scandalous parts of this book. We're going to talk about Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero. So if you came to hear a certain part, this is what you came to hear. Okay. Tiberius was the inheritor he was the second emperor, right? Right after Augustus. Says page 108, page 109, that he says, "If only my brother were alive to lose another fleet, that would thin out the population a little." Depop. Let's see. Let me get to the juicy parts here. Tiberius on signs and omens. He was a pretty normal guy, like when he was born and when he was young, but then he slips into this degeneracy. And he sort of while Augustus was born, Tiberius decides to leave, and he goes to Campania and then to the Isle of Capri. But it says, while Tiberius was a mere infant, Scribonius the astrologer prophesied for him an illustrious career and a crownless kingship. Though, of course, nobody in those days knew that Caesars would become all but kings in name, because they weren't kings, they became emperors, right? And Augustus really loved Tiberius and sort of let him do what he wanted, but because he had everything, he became a complete degenerate. And it says, Augustus even said, Seutonius says, "Yet how could so prudent and farsighted an emperor have acted as blindly in this as this in a matter of such importance? My belief is that Augustus weighed Tiberius' good qualities against the bad and decided that the good tipped the scale. He had, after all, publicly sworn that his adoption of Tiberius was in the national interest." And then it has excerpts of his letters. Let's see, Aribus Tineo Lupum, that he was holding a wolf by the ears. Tiberius did not like censorship. censorship. He was against censorship. He didn't care what anybody said about him. Same with Nero and a bunch of these guys. And he did some good stuff. He built some, roads and public works and stuff. But then he removes all Christians from Rome and then drafts them into the military and has them killed. He crushes city riots mercilessly. Okay, here we go. Page 131. All right, you guys ready? Okay. This talks about his drinking. And he spent 2 whole days in the intervening night in an orgy of food and drink with this guy Flaccus and then Piso. And then they were good fellas at all hours of the day or night. He quotes, "Hey, he's a good fella. He's a good fella. Tommy, why can't you be more like your brother Tony? Why can't you settle down?" Hey, Ma, I settled down. Right? I settled down. I go out every night. I settle down with somebody, then I can't wake up. I do it again, right? They have this party and they inspect all of the waitresses for the party, and it says that they require them all to be naked. Page 131. Section 43 on Tiberius, page 131. On retiring to Capri, he made himself a private sporting house where sexual extravagances were practiced for his secret pleasure. Bevies of girls and young men whom he had collected from all over the empire as adepts in unnatural practices and known as spintrii would copulate before him in groups of 3 to excite his waning passions. The inmates of the establishment would know exactly what was expected of them. I doubt that. He furthermore devised little nooks of lechery in the woods and glades of the island and had BOYS and GIRLS dressed up as pans and nymphs prostituting themselves in front of caverns or grottos. Some aspects of his criminal obscenity are almost too vile to discuss, much less believe. Okay, here you got, if you don't want to hear this, mute for like a minute. Okay, imagine training little BOYS, whom he called his minnows, to chase him while he went swimming and get between his legs to LICK and nibble him. Or letting BABIES, not yet weaned from their mother's breast, suck at his breast, or GROIN, such a filthy old man he had become. No fucking shit. Excuse my language. This guy's got to go. These people got to go. And go they did, except they're still around now. Right. Okay, so that was the bad part. That was one bad part. Let's see. Okay, so the fate of Tiberius's family, my note says they are flogged, their eyes are gouged out, they're starved, and they are SUICIDED. And he was described when he was young by his tutor as mud kneaded with blood. He is a total, says on page 139, section 59, but in reality, he did other wicked deeds to gratify his lust for seeing people suffer. Soon Tiberius broke out in every sort of cruelty and never lacked for victims. Page 141, not a day, however holy, passed without an execution. Many of his men victims were accused and punished with their children, some actually by their children. So this is pure Mengele trauma bonding, right? This is pure sadistic Satanism. The bodies of all the executed persons were flung on the stairs of mourning and dragged to the Tiber with hooks, as many as 20 a day, including women and children. Tradition forbade the strangling of VIRGINS, so when the little GRLS had been condemned to die in this way, the executioner began by violating them. Can't talk about his torture because that's too bad. His page 145. I wrote Satanist, sadist. He wrote his left hand was more agile than his right because of the left hand path, right? And so strong that he could poke a finger through a sound newly plucked apple or into the skull of a boy or young man. How is that your metric, right? His belief in astrology persuaded him that the world was wholly ruled by fate. So he just didn't give a shit about anything. One of his idols was Minos, King Minos. We just discussed Minos, right? In the Dante's Inferno stream. Remember, Minos built the labyrinth and put the Minotaur in it, but Minos demands a sacrifice of 14 people every year, right? 7 boys, 7 girls. And then in hell, he is the one who he has a tail, like a serpent's tail, and he wraps around his body the number of times that to direct the soul, the damned soul, where they will be sent in hell to what circle. But that was his idol, like. And it says that he engaged in the same things that Minos demanded, which means that he demanded human sacrifice. So what I'm saying here is that, a lot of times when we read about these awful things that these people do now, we forget about the origins of these things, right? And you talk about, illuminate, confirm, and the, Masonic rituals and the Egyptians and all this stuff. But we often forget that one of the models for this sort of depravity and decadence is the Roman Empire. And this is it, like in actuality, this is like actually what they're doing. Finally, there's not really an account of it here so much of Tiberius's death. Tacitus has the better account, because what ends up happening is he is smothered to death by his Praetorian guard, Macro. Macro was a famous guy, but Macro finally killed him. But Tiberius' cruelty continued even after his death, because the people that he condemned to death, it didn't get through fast enough in the court, and the executioners were like, well, we haven't heard anything yet, so just to be safe from Tiberius, we might as well execute these people. So they did. So then that made the people hate him even more. So then when Tiberius died, of course, Caligula comes along. Now, Caligula everybody knows Caligula, right? Caligula rules for like 3 years. He's so bad, he rules for like 3 years, but he was hated by Tiberius, and Tiberius was Tiberius's granddad. But anyway, it says one time that Tiberius woke up to find Caligula as a boy in his room with a dagger, and he was going to kill him, just like Macbeth with Duncan. But then he decided not to, and then Tiberius never spoke he never spoke a word about it until a letter that he wrote. But he knew that Caligula was a viper, even from a young age. Of course, how could he not be with this sick, twisted guy doing all this stuff in his presence? I mean, he probably did it to him. That doesn't excuse him. I'm just saying that's probably the reason, right? So let's see. Germanicus was the father of Caligula, and Germanicus was a great guy. Germanicus was a well-liked and well-known hero. He was pious. He was a poet. Pious, of course, he was a pagan, but poet and dramatist. He was a warrior. He was a lawyer. He was handsome. He was kind-hearted. But he found that spells and potions were used against him. Eventually, I think it's Nero who ends up killing him. That was the first Germanicus. Nero kills the second Germanicus. And eventually, Caligula is made emperor. Of course, Caligula's name, his real name was Gaius Caesar, right? But everybody calls him Caligula even to this day. Caligula means little boots, because when he was young, he would hang out with the military, and he would like have little toy armor and stuff. He would go with them on military campaigns, and they loved him. And they gave him a little pair of boots that he wore. But even in those days when he was young, it says he could not control his natural brutality and viciousness. He loved watching tortures and executions, and disguised in wig and robe, abandoned himself nightly to the pleasures of gluttonous and adulterous living. Tiberius said, I am nursing a viper for the Roman people, he once said, and a phaethon for the whole world. Ain't that the truth? That's page 155. Page 156, this part's crazy. It says, on his arrival in the Senate, in the city, the Senate and a crowd of people who had forced their way to the house immediately and unanimously conferred absolute power upon him. They set aside Tiberius's will, which made his other grandson, then still a child, joint heir with Gaius. And so splendidly were the celebrations that 160,000 victims were publicly sacrificed the next 3 months, or perhaps even a shorter period. Now, people will say that's a representative number, but I've come to think as I get older that a lot of times in when we read historical documents, right, that a lot of times that when they talk about these numbers like this, I mean, sometimes, if we're talking about a battle, yeah, it can be a representative number. But I think that a lot of times when they do stuff like this, they say 160,000 victims. Which I don't know a reason why it wouldn't be that number. Does that make sense, you guys? I mean, they kill everybody else. Everybody else is sacrificed. Why wouldn't they find 160,000 people that they're going to sacrifice throughout the entire Roman Empire? I mean, I think that that's probably a literal number. Why wouldn't that be a literal number? Let's see, page 157. Caligula drove from the city the perverts known as the Spintrii, and could with difficulty be restrained from drowning the lot. Now, that's probably the Spintrii are the perverts that Tiberius had hired, right, in his eyes wide shut palace or whatever. And this is when Caligula is still good. Now, Caligula at some point suffers a traumatic brain injury. I mean, they describe it as such. And when he wakes up, he's like a different man. And I think that's probably a result of what to me is amazing is that the number of these emperors and these powerful people who, it's just like today, they're obviously inbred. They obviously have been subjected to some sort of, satanic ritual abuse. It's obviously traumatic ritual, ABUSE. I just said it. There's no reason I have to spell it. But, and they have these brain injuries and they have these horrible things done to them. And then they go on and they just are let loose to do absolutely depraved things. And yet the empire continues to run. Right. So it doesn't make sense on the normie level. Why would that make sense? And I think that's because of it's the same now in terms of the sort of variety of the power structure. There's obviously more powerful people or people behind the throne where there are powerful people other than just the single emperor. Remember when in Blood Meridian, the judge talks about he wants to be made the suzerain of the earth. There are other kings, right, on the earth, all with power under a power structure, and he wants to be one of those. It's like this. It's like there's an emperor, but they're constantly getting being paid fealty by various kings of kingdoms that they've conquered throughout the empire, which just shows you the variety of the power structure and how it's layered, right, in that pyramid. Page 161, Caligula as insane tyrant. This says, section 22, so much for the emperor. The rest of this history must deal with this monster, Seutonius says pretty bluntly. Let's see. Caligula established a shrine to himself as God, with priests and the costliest possible victims and a life-size golden image. When the moon shone full and bright, he always invited the moon goddess to sexual intercourse with his bed. And I wrote, he invites Diana to his bed, sex with the moon goddess, diadems, and he's obviously engaged in the rites of Diana, right? Once he was overheard threatening a statue of Jupiter. If you do not raise me up to heaven, I will cast you down to hell. So he's totally schizoid. He's schizophrenic. He loathes being compared to Agrippa, his granddad, and he would fly into a rage if anyone mentioned him in speech or song as an ancestor of the Caesars, and he would have them executed. Are we okay, you guys? How are we doing on the video? We doing all right? Don't forget, you guys, please, everyone here has, I'm sure, smash that like. If you're watching this later, please take just 1 second, hit that like. You can also hit that subscribe bell and make sure you get notifications so you can be here with us in the live stream. Also, please, if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and subscribe, you guys. We kind of slowed down on the subs. We kind of hit a little plateau here for a minute. So we're trying to get up to 1,000. We've done pretty well. It was a pretty steady climb. Now we're kind of flatlining. So help me get to 1,000 subs, guys. I would really appreciate that. Also, if you can, let's see, Kristen, Derek, and Kim, please drop me a super chat, right? Drop me a Cash App or a PayPal. I appreciate your support. Thank you, guys. He has he makes his own father-in-law cut his throat with a razor. He, Section 24, page 162. It was his habit to commit incest with each of his 3 sisters and large banquets when his wife reclined above him, placed them all in turn below him. They say he ravished his sister Drusilla before he came of age. At her death, on page 163, he made it a capital offense to laugh, to bathe, or to dine with one's parents, wives, or children while the period of public mourning lasted, and was so crazed with grief that he suddenly rushed from Rome by night, drove through Campania, took ship to Syracuse, and returned just as impetuously without having shaved or cut his hair in the meantime. He's insane, right? He's got like DID, MPD. He attended the wedding ceremony of Piso and Livia, but had the bride carried off to his own home. And then at parties, he would talk about other people's wives, and he would just take them away and do those things with them, come back, and, he would just cut people right in their face. And then he would say he had taken a wife in the style of Romulus and Augustus. He would parade women in front of his parties naked. What finally convinced him of his own paternity was, one of them says that this lady is that she's had his daughter. He says, no, you haven't. And then what finally convinced him of his own paternity was her violent temper. While still an infant, she would try to scratch her little playmates' faces and eyes. So Caligula was like, oh, that must be my daughter, right? Cut from the same cloth. Often he would send for men whom he had secretly killed as though they were still alive, and remark offhandedly a few days later that they must have committed suicide. I think this is probably a source for, other than the actual historical source and the history of the kings of Britain, etc. For Shakespeare's Macbeth, right? I think this is one of the sources. I could see this. You can see how this would inspire him, right? Because this is exactly what Macbeth does with Banquo, right? Would he were here, right? They have this banquet honoring his best friend. And he says, oh, but he's not here. He must be off, doing something. He must be off playing, right? No, he just gaslighting everybody. Thank you. Shouts out to Adam Hirsch out there for that $5 donation on PayPal. Really appreciate you, homeboy. Thank you so much, Adam. Thank you for watching, for being here with us. Really appreciate you. Y'all, every little bit counts. I mean, we all know that. Let's see. He behaved just as arrogantly and violently towards the other orders of society. Caligula liked to stir up trouble in the theater by scattering gift vouchers before the seats were occupied, thus tempting commoners to invade the rows reserved for knights. He's an agent provocateur. people are fighting, and he walks up and he drops a knife in between them and says, here you go. I'm just going to leave this here. That's what Norm used to say that. Norm Macdonald. The following instances on page 165 will illustrate his bloodthirstiness. Having collected wild animals for one of his shows, he found butcher's meat too expensive and decided to feed them with criminals instead. He paid no attention to the charge sheets, but simply stood in the middle of a colonnade, glanced at the prisoner lined up before him, and gave the orders, kill every man between that bald head and the other one over there, Seutonius says. Many men of decent family were branded at his command. Sounds like what's the name of the guy who branded them? What'd you call that? The guy with the glasses and the Hollywood actresses. Yeah, I'm drawing a blank because I'm on here and I can't think of it. Chuck Connors. Thank you. Yes, Nixon. Thank you, Jason. Always on point. Appreciate you. Chuck Connors. Others were confined in narrow cages where they had to crouch on all fours like animals or were sawn in half. Guys made parents attend their sons' executions. And of course, this happens repeatedly with some of the emperors. If the emperor is going to execute somebody, right? Let's say he's going to execute a man, and then the grown sons come and try to sue for a leniency. Big mistake, because now they're all executed. And then he just gets the whole family executed. I'm not saying it's a mistake they went to try and help him. They should have just aerated this guy, right? When they went to sue for peace. Don't sue for peace. Just get rid of the guy, right? Why would you think he's going to give you leniency? The smell of suppurating brains became insupportable. So Caligula brought him back, removed his tongue, and then ordered the sentence to be carried out. He would just sit there with people. In the movie Caligula, this is true to life. I read this. I think it's in Tacitus. In the movie Caligula, which was financed by, was it Bob Guccione? But Caligula had this machine. He did have various machines built, and he would sit there and he would bury people up to their neck, and he would have this machine, and it would just come and just like lop off heads, and he would just throw apples at it. Just a totally sick, he was not satisfied until the victim's limbs, organs, and guts had been dragged to the street and heaped up at his feet. I mean, he's just a true Caligula. Everything they say about Caligula in that sense is just true. He's just sick. His motto basically was, let them hate me so long as they fear me, which is pretty Machiavellian. Of course, they didn't fear him after a while. They just were tired of him. When on page 168, when the bridge across the sea at Puteoli was being blessed, he invited a number of spectators from the shore to inspect it, then abruptly tipped them into the water. Some clung to the ship's rudders, but he had them dislodged with boat hooks and oars and left to drown. A gladiator was fencing with a wooden sword, and he fell down deliberately, and Caligula saw this. So he went up and drew a real dagger and stabbed him to death. The consuls were reclining next to him by the forum, and they were sharing a joke. And it says, and they said, what do you think? He answered, it occurred to me that I have only to give one nod and both your throats will be cut on the spot. He played a prank on this actor. He went to the theater and he said, which of the two of us is greater? The guy said, I don't know. I don't want to answer. And then he walked up and grabbed him by the throat and he said, and this beautiful throat will be cut whenever I please. He almost destroyed the works of Plato, Virgil, and Livy. He almost had them all burned. Thank goodness he didn't. Any good-looking man with a fine head of hair whom Caligula ran across, he himself was bald, lost his hair, had the back of his scalp brutally shaved. Besides incest with his sisters, he had a notorious passion for prostitutes, and he was accused of creeper relations, both active and passive. They asked him why he was spending so much money. We're talking about Caligula here and Suetonius. This is crazy because this stuff is so scandalous to read, right? You're listening to this right now and you're thinking this is disgusting. We're not watching we're not watching a current day film where we're seeing all this vile stuff. This is a 2,000-year-old text. Caligula and Nero completely emptied out. They completely depleted the treasury for Rome. They just depleted it. And somebody asked Caligula about this, and he said that a man must be either frugal or a Caesar. They just did not care. They said they thought it was their duty to just deplete the entire empire. On page 170, I can't even read this part. On another day, he took some hostages from a certain kind of SCHOOL and ordered them on ahead of him. Later, he left he basically played the most dangerous game. He had a book that he wrote, 2 books that he wrote himself and he kept in secret called The Dagger and the Sword, and they were his hit lists. Eventually, after he was killed, somebody found him and threw him into the sea. He worked on page 177. He worked hard to make his naturally forbidding and uncouth face even more repulsive by practicing fearful and horrifying grimaces in front of a mirror. Gaius Caligula was in fact sick, both physically and mentally. Insomnia was his worst torment. And he had 2 qualities: overconfidence and extreme timorousness. Classic schizoid, MPD, DID, just total demon guy, right? Page 178. Let's see. He would often affect a gold beard. He wore a fake gold beard. He carried a thunderbolt, trident, or serpent-twined staff in his hand, and he would even dress up as Venus. He hung out with actors. The infamous part is he tried to make his horse most people think of it as a senator, but this says his horse was named Incitatus. Incitatus. He even planned to award Incitatus a consulship. He wanted to make Incitatus his horse the highest in rank in the land. And finally, finally he was assassinated he was stabbed through his genitals, and his jawbone was split by the Praetorian guards, by centurions. And they also killed his wife and his infant daughter. They just wanted to get rid of their whole line. Okay. Crazy, right? All right, I'm going to skip Claudius because we could talk about Claudius, but Claudius was he was popular. He was actually popular and well-liked, but he was also a buffoon. And he was the butt of all Caligula's jokes. And he inherited the empire after the death of Caligula. So now I'm going to talk about Nero. This is going to be my last section. I'm going to talk about Nero and then we'll end it. So even though it's 12 Caesars, we're not going to go through all the Caesars. They're all depraved and they all were pretty nasty people. But what do you guys think about this? What are you guys thinking? I was somewhere back in the no. Y'all, can you believe that? You believe JD coming after our boy Michael McDonald's? I mean, come on, right? He went from somewhere back in the no. No, but that was funny though, right? And listen, I don't know about y'all. I don't know about y'all out there, but this morning I went out to Paula Dean. It's actually connected to the T-Bell and the Michael McDonald's. It's right by the Stuckies. All right, you know what I'm talking about? It's right by the Stuckies. My uncle Cletus took me over there And we went in there and he said, listen, you ever had any fried Chewbacca knuckles with some cheese? And I said, damn, order me some Chewbacca knuckles. And he said, and then he called Diddy. And Diddy said, Diddy called in. He knew the waitress. And we put her on the phone and she said, oh, listen, I'm here with you. She said, Diddy, I'm here with you. I'm here with Cletus. I told him I'd whip him up some good Chewbacca knuckles with cheese anytime you want. What do you think about that? And y'all, they were playing Michael McDonald's that whole time. No, but I love Michael McDonald. I keep forgetting that I love anymore. I keep forgetting that I'll never be the same again. Sorry, y'all. No, but listen, after this, go and watch Yamo Be There with Michael McDonald and James Ingram. And it's like the Quincy Jones remix. Dude, that song rules. Go and watch that video. That song rules. Okay, so here's Nero on page 114. His son by Antonia the Elder became Nero's father and was a wholly despicable character. Once driving through a village on the Appian Way, he whipped up his horses and deliberately ran over and killed a boy. And when a knight criticized him rather freely in the forum, he gouged out one of his eyes there and then. Finally, Nero becomes the emperor at age, I think, 17. Nero's horoscope on page 216 occasioned many ominous predictions that he would be a child born to Agrippina and was bound to have a detestable nature and become a public danger. Let's see. Nero would become a rival to Britannicus. They sent assassins to strangle him during his siesta. They were driven away in terror, people said, by a snake, which suddenly darted from beneath Nero's pillow. And Agrippina, his vile mother, has the snake skin made into like a gold band, and Nero wore it for almost the rest of his life till he got rid of it. Nero's tutor, by the way, was Seneca. And later on, Nero drives Seneca to Suicide, which is crazy, right? Because Nero's tutor is Seneca, and Alexander's tutor is Aristotle, and Aristotle's is Plato, and Plato's is Socrates. But of course, all the Roman emperors had. Alexander wasn't Roman emperor, I know that, but those were Greeks. But all the Roman emperors had illustrious philosophers as tutors. Let's see. Nero did build some public works. I mean, he had built the Crypta Portico and the Domus Aurea at great cost to the Roman people. But he did improve the Rome, the Campus Mars, the Colosseum, etc. And some of his good qualities, good if he had any. If Nero was asked to sign the usual execution order for a felon, he would sigh, how I wish that I had never learned to write. Of course, he would write it anyway. He gave an immense variety of entertainments, chariot races. He made 400 senators and 600 knights, some of them rich and respectable, do battle in the arena. That's kind of cool in a way. Can you imagine just putting Lindsey Graham in the arena and saying, going, you and all these other degens got to fight it out. Oh, I just don't know what I do, y'all. That's just crazy. At one stage of the Minotaur ballet, an actor disguised as a bull actually mounted another who played Pacify and occupied the hindquarters of a hollow wooden heifer during one of the performances that Nero was watching. And he loved that, of course, because he's degenerate. And of course, it's the Minotaur because they're sacrificing to the bull and the Baal and all these people. Let's see. Obviously, Nero was, it's obvious to see why Nero was seen as the Antichrist, right? He's this Antichrist figure, certainly. I mean, he persecutes Christians. He, in Tacitus, they talk about how Nero would take Christians who were arrested, and he would crucify them and then burn them as torches for his parties. It's fucking just total. He's just burning so hard in hell right now. Nero's atrocities. Page 223. So Nero's thing was like that he had this lust for like fame, even though he was the emperor. He had a lust for fame, like in terms of like he wanted to be a great poet slash speaker slash actor, and he would disguise himself and audition for various roles. And he would even play the lyre. It says at Neapolis. His first stage appearance was at Neapolis, where, disregarding an earthquake which shook the theater, he sang his piece through to the end. That shows you his complete psychopathy, right? He actually did sing in tragedies and and he drove chariots in the races. He drove a 10-horse team, a novelty for which he had censured King Mithridates in one of his own poems. Nero was a poet. Let's see. Oh, so in his private life, Suetonius talks about how he and his friends essentially would disguise themselves, would go out, they'd go slumming. They'd slumming it. They go slumming it. And they go out and get drunk in the taverns. They probably go out and get drunk in the taverns, smoke some Egyptian opium. And then they would essentially just rob and beat innocent people in the street. And it might have been possible to excuse his insolent, lustful, and extravagant, greedy, or cruel early practices by saying that boys will be boys. Yet at the same time, this was clearly the true Nero, not merely Nero in his adolescence. He would prowl the streets in search of mischief. He would attack men on their way home from dinner and stab them if they offered resistance, and then drop their bodies down the sewers. He's just a serial killer, right? During these escapades, he often risked being blinded or killed. Once he was beaten almost to death by a senator whose wife he had molested, which taught him never to go out after dark. Well, that guy should have murked him, right? Prostitutes, dancing girls, not satisfied with seducing freeborn boys and married women, Nero, raped the Vestal Virgin Rupria. He also tried to turn the boy Sporus into a GIRL by castration. He's a creep. He's just the most demonic, right? He had a lecherous passion for his mother Agrippina. Okay, here's the page 229 is kind of one of the heights of depravity. Nero practiced every kind of again, anybody listening, if you're scandalized, this is a 2,000-year-old text from Seutonius. Okay, I'm just quoting from the text and offering commentary, right? We're analyzing the text here, you guys. Nero practiced every kind of obscenity, and after defiling almost every part of his body, finally invented a novel game. He was released from a cage dressed in the skins of wild animals and attacked the private parts of men and women who stood bound to stakes. After working up sufficient excitement by this means, he was dispatched, shall we say, Suetonius says, by his freedman, Doriphorus. Doriphorus now married him, just as he himself had married Sporus, and on the wedding night, he imitated the screams and moans of a GIRL being deflowered. According to my informants, he was convinced that nobody could remain chaste or pure in any part of his body, but that most people concealed their secret vices. Hence, if anyone confessed to obscene practices, Nero forgave him all his other crimes. Right? They asked him about his money spending, and he said, "True gentlemen always throw their money about." He wasted his money, but we're talking the entire fortune of the Roman treasury, right? It talks about him building his Domus Aurea. You can still go to the Crypto Portico now in Rome. Anybody who's been to Rome, go to the site of the Domus Aurea near the Colosseum, and you can go into the Crypto Portico. Um, um, the main dining room was circular, and its roof revolved day and night in time with the sky. Right? Imagine the architectural. Yeah, Seneca. You can imagine Seneca was just like, this guy's hopeless. So imagine the architectural wonder, the wonder that he built at the Domus Aurea with this revolving dome sky, right? Which is almost like Kubla Khan in Coleridge. And all of that engineering lost. When the palace had been decorated throughout in his lavish style, Nero dedicated and condescended to remark, "Good, now at last I can begin to live like a human being." What a dickhead, right? So they Rome essentially went broke because of him, and they said he said he would go and he would say, "I need more money," and then they would say, "Why?" And he would say, "You know my needs. Let us see to it that nobody is left with anything." And so basically, he just pillaged and robbed all of the everyone. Right? He made up laws and just robbed everyone. He was just a total extortionist. Um, this talks about how Claudius was the first victim of his murderous career because he probably, if he didn't personally assassinate his uncle Claudius, with the mushrooms, right? With the muscaria, right? That DPH has talked about, probably, right? DPH is the Church of the Eternal Logos, is the authority on this. Let's see. Somebody accosted. So then he had hired a poisoner named Locusta. Reminds me of the arch poisoner Sid Gottlieb, right? Of the specific intel agency with 3 letters. But he asked her to poison Claudius. It didn't work, and then she says, "Well, I watered down the poison a little bit, so that like you wouldn't be suspected." And Nero says, "So you think I'm afraid of the Julian law?" So then they administer it to a kid. I think that's to a goat, and then to a pig. It works. And then they poison his cousin Britannicus. Britannicus was, again, one of these popular guys who was probably a good guy who would say mean shit to Nero because he deserved it. Britannicus dropped dead at the very first taste, and Nero lyingly assured the guests that the poor boy had long been subject to these epileptic seizures. He's just gaslighting them. It talks about his gang stalking. He would get groups of people and criminals to constantly drive or sail past the windows of people that he had exiled from Rome in Rhodes, and he would disturb them with jeers and catcalls at all hours of the night. He then turns on his mother. He tries to have her poisoned 3 times, Agrippina. She survives all 3 poisonings. Then he built her a boat for this party, a barge, and he said, "Go on out and have yourself a good time." And he walked up, he let her off there, and he said, "Go on, I got you a boat." She said, "Thank you." And then they went out, and then the boat collapsed, and she was drowning. But then she swam to another boat, and then that boat was another collapsible boat, and then that boat collapsed. Then she survived that. She's like Rasputin. She survives that one. But then she gets back to shore, and then he has her just straight up assassinated. And then Nero rushes off to examine Agrippina's corpse, handling her limbs and between drinks to satisfy his thirst, discussing their good and bad points. I think this is about Necropelia. And then he often admitted he was hounded by his mother's ghost, demon, and that the Furies were pursuing him with whips and burning torches. They were. And he set Persian magicians at work to conjure up the ghost and entreat its forgiveness. Then he becomes an adept in the mystery rites. and he engages in necromancy. Then he murders his aunt. Then he gets married again, and he tries to this lady Octavia, and he tries to unsuccessfully to strangle her on several occasions. Then he marries this girl Poppaea, whom he married 12 days after his divorce. He kicked her to death while she was pregnant and ill because she complained that he came home late from the races. Says he destroyed every other member of his family, including relatives by marriage, in the same way. He committed an indecent assault on young Aulus and then put him to death. He drove Seneca to commit suicide. And then Nero resolved on a wholesale massacre of the nobility. No considerations on page 235, section 37. No considerations of selection or moderation restrained Nero from murdering anyone he pleased. He murdered this one guy because he looked like an old cross schoolmaster. He would, whenever he told anybody to his guards to take care of somebody, remember in Pulp Fiction, ever take care of her? No, man, not like that. That meant that they would open their veins. He was eager, it is said, to get hold of a certain Egyptian, a sort of ogre, who would eat raw flesh and practically anything else he was given, and watch him tear live men to pieces and then devour them. These successes, as Nero called them, went to his head, and he boasted that no previous sovereign had ever realized the extent of his power. Later, there's a fire in Rome, not the fire, but the fire in Rome. He says, when I'm dead, may fire consume the earth. And then Nero says, no, while I'm alive. Then he brazenly set fire to the city. He walks around. He does what happened probably remember 2 years ago in the land of OZ and in the land of where OK lives in this country, when all of those FIRES were appearing all of a sudden, right? And people were saying direct energy weapons and all that stuff. Well, same thing that happened in New Orleans in 2005, right? With all of the premium, all of the land gets purposefully destroyed and burned or swallowed up or whatever. And then it's bought up by BlackRock or corporations, right? At a premium. That's exactly what Nero did in Rome. He set fire to the city. He burned everybody out of their town, right? Out of their homes. He forbid anybody. He also he owned the fire departments. So he remember that there's a scene about that in Gangs of New York. Remember where they basically have an extortion front where they set fire to buildings and then they go and they rescue them at a cost. And then he forbid anybody from going inside who used to live there to fetch any of their valuables, because he would confiscate them and then sell them for himself or the treasury. Let's see. He set fire to the city. This is when he fiddled while Rome burned. He set fire to the city, and he watched from a tower of Messinus, and enraptured by what he called the beauty of the flames, then put on his tragedian's costume and sang the sack of Ilium from beginning to end. So he fiddled, meaning he played the lyre and sang about the sack of Ilium, which is like the Iliad, right? Which is the destruction of Troy. And remarked on the beauty of the flames and this hellscape around him, right? In a single autumn, 30,000 deaths from plague were registered at the temple of Libitina, and there was a British disaster. There's just disaster everywhere, all around. Kind of like in Macbeth, right? How or it's like in the Fisher King, how when the land suffers as a mirror of the depravity that's going on. Or in the Fisher King, it mirrors the destruct or the injury to the Fisher King, and then it will be restored. Let's see. Agrippina also had said to Nero, "Hell guides your feet." He ruled for 14 years. He didn't care about people saying anything about him, or he didn't censor people, I guess it's good. But only 2 taunts against him went home: a suggestion that he was a bad lyre player, and an insulting reference to him as Ahenobarbus rather than Nero Caesar, because his name was Ahenobarbus. That's why he had Germanicus killed. Nero insisted on page 240 that to lose the supreme power while still alive was something that had never happened to anyone else before. And yet he made not the slightest attempt to alter his lazy and extravagant life. Eventually, he proposed to the Senate. He considered giving the army free permission to pillage Gaul, poison the entire Senate at a banquet, and set fire to the city again, but letting wild beasts loose in the street to hinder the citizens from saving themselves. Oh my gosh. Right? Finally, implications of auspices of omens old and new and in his own dreams began to terrify Nero. And then finally, he's walking home. Oh, no, he wakes up in the palace and he calls out and nobody's there. His guard has departed. They've left him. Then he goes out and he's in his tunic and barefoot, but he simply pulled on a faded cloak and hat, took horse and trotted off holding a handkerchief over his face. Suddenly an earth tremor was felt and lightning flashed in their eyes, which terrified Nero. And then eventually he gets pursued by the centurions, and he's about to commit suicide, and he says, "Dead, and so great an artist." And then he stabs himself in the throat, and he was already half dead when a centurion entered, pretending to have rushed to his rescue and staunched the wound with his cloak. Nero muttered, here is Nero's last words, "Too late, but what fidelity." He died with his eyes blazing and bulging from their sockets, a sight which horrified everybody present. He had wished not to let his head be cut off. It talks about him killing artists and actors. His page 247, section 55, Nero's unreasonable craving for immortal fame made him change a number of well-known names of things and places to his own favor. He despised all religious cults except that of the Syrian goddess, and showed one day that he had changed his mind even about her by urinating on her divine image. So he's just and he also he made a sacrifice to Dis, which is literally Satan. Remember in Dante's Inferno, when they get to the city of Dis, and then finally Dante refers to Satan as Dis, Beelzebub, and Lucifer, right? But he makes a sacrifice to Dis. So he was in every way a live Antichrist. So that's it. I'm going to stop there. Wow, that was not light material, y'all. Right? But listen, here's what I hope you got out of that, right, you guys? This was against Seutonius, the 12 Caesars, and this is a 2,000-year-old text about the depravity, degeneracy, and the absolute megalomania of the Caesars, right? And when we talk about literature, again, I've reiterated so many times how we're not supposed to read literature for a moral, right, or a lesson. I do think that it is interesting that we read this because it's also history, that one of the things that we can glean from this is that as I mentioned this earlier, as Domitian says, he claimed that the lot of all emperors is necessarily wretched, since only their assassination can convince the public that the conspiracies against their lives are real. Right? And now we live in a world where conspiracy, right, is, people, it's fiction, right? Everything's a theory, right? But this emperor says himself that these things are real, that they exist. We see this in history. We see this now. We see the same things that we just read, we know happen now. There's all you have to do is read current events, white papers, and books, and pay attention, stay dialed in, and know that all of the same depraved things happen now. They just are either under wraps or they happen on a more varied scale, but they happen now and worse, right? And that's because the same power structure, the structure that existed then, continues to exist now. There's a reason why the Roman Empire became the British Empire in all of its trappings, in its administration, in its law, right? And why that then was inherited by the American Empire, right? The Pax Americana, where the entire world is at war all the time, right? And yet the empire runs it through its pyramidal structure. So we see the same things happening now. And I think that the writing of this book is amazing. I think it, in terms of just pure literature, I think it's an exhilarating book because obviously it's violent and vile and all those things, but not only is it not fictional, but it reads like fiction, right? It's so well written, and it's the way that the book is formatted, the syntax with Robert Graves' translation, the form and the content, again, synthesized to produce this meaning. And the meaning is the worldview that we have just discussed, right? Where you have to be aware and be on your guard and not naive and stay dialed in. Ain't it, y'all? So what do you think? What do you think about that? I keep forgetting. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate y'all. Please make sure that you share this stream, tell your friends about it, tell your family if you want, put it on your social media. Please, let people know I'll be here. I'm here at least 3 times a week doing these. I think the next stream we'll do something more lighthearted, something a little less vile, or no more degradation for a minute. I consider doing Norm Macdonald's book this week. Maybe we'll do that next, just because it's funny. And yeah, we'll keep going from there. Let me know what you think. Keep giving me suggestions. Thank you to everybody who continuously comments after the video, who hits the like button to get the algorithm up. And we're going to keep going. We got to get to that 1,000. We've kind of plateaued. So help me get my subs up. And please don't, you can support me at any time. Just drop me I'll thank you on here, and I'll read any chat, any comments or questions that you have. We all try to make it out here, y'all. So thank you so much for your support. I love you all out there. Thank you to my homies. Shouts out to beautiful Eliana. Shouts out to Jethro, to Mixkey, to Natesky. Shouts out to Jerry out there working hard out there, slanging ice, going to Pennsylvania and all these places. Shouts out to everyone who supported me, and all my friends and family out there. And I love you guys. Stay cool out there, y'all. We're getting into that summer heat, right? You got to stay cool. So watch yourselves out there. Love each other. And I will talk to y'all later. Okay? Love you guys. Peace.